a very warm welcome to CARE Conference on Communication and Social Change, Integrating Theory and Praxis. It really is a pleasure to have you with us, and such a joy really to celebrate some of the work that we have been doing at CARE. The first session that we will share with you here is a performance piece that draws upon the thematic field work that we have been carrying out at CARE for the past 3 years. And the performance piece integrates poetry that's drawn out of our fieldwork notes, as well as visual images that have been put together by Julio Etchart, who has been working at CARE for the past 2 years, and we've been incredibly lucky to have him with us. So before we get started, I want to do a quick introduction of Julio, since it's been such a joy to have him with us. We also have multilingual audiences in many languages, so I will give pauses throughout the presentation so that we can translate for our audiences in other languages. So it really has been an honor to have Julio with us. Julio is a photojournalist by profession who grew up in Uruguay and later settled in the UK, studying documentary photography, photojournalism, and filmmaking, and really being one of the pioneers of the photo voice method. He traveled around the world, making international films and international media on projects of social change, documenting the voices and lives of the poor, the disenfranchised, and those at the margins. He worked with a variety of non-governmental organizations, including War on Want, Save the Children, Oxfam, Christian Aid, CAPOT, BSO, UNICEF, the British Council, and the European Union. So when Julio came to us, we really were honored to have him with us for the principles and the philosophy he embodied and the experience he brought with him. He's a member of the Panos Pictures Agency in the UK. After being awarded a World Press Photo First Prize in the Environment category, he produced The Four Elements, a touring exhibition on ecological issues, sponsored by the European Union. He has had 5 photo books published, one of which is Toys, a photo book for children that tries to bring his philosophy and make it accessible to children, on children at play around our planet, which won him an UNICEF award. Julio has pioneered participatory image-making methods, and over the past couple of years, he's been working with us on developing various participatory photographic techniques and strategies, working with communities at the margins. So this really is a celebration of Julio. We are saying goodbye to him at the end of this conference. Really, he's going back to London and working on some exciting projects. It's been incredible to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Mohan, and everybody at CARE and CNN. It's been a privilege working with you and your team. And it's not very common to find that intersection of academic and field work and commitment to social justice and working with civil society, not under your direction. So I'm very privileged to work with you.
So our presentation is titled Communicative, Inversions, Violence, Markets, and Neoliberalism. Throughout this presentation, we will make a very simple argument that essential to the neoliberal project is the idea of freedom, but it's an idea of freedom that has been communicatively inverted. So let me explain briefly what I mean by communicative inversion. Communicative inversion is the use of communication strategies to achieve the exact opposite of what is articulated in the inversion, meaning that it's a form of enunciation that says exactly the opposite of the materiality that it represents. So the neoliberal project, we make the argument, and this is based upon a variety of field sites we have been working on, is based upon and has been propagated on the fundamentals of communicative inversion. Inversions, in other words, transform the materiality of everyday and dramatic events through representations. Representations that are simulated to be the opposite of the materialities that they intend to signify. This is of course achieved through positions of power and agendas of power that are serviced through these inversions, that are achieved through a variety of strategies that use communication, marketing, advertising, communication campaigns, public relations to achieve this. In this collection, through images and representations, we critically interrogate communicative inversions and symbolic representations of events that punctuate the crucial moments in the birth of neoliberalism, particularly the unpacked ideas of democracy, freedom, market, that are essential to putting together and establishing the hegemony of neoliberal enterprise globally. Whereas some of these moments are dramatic in their performances, so we will witness killings, we will witness tortures, we will witness incarceration. Other events are more mundane. They are part of our everyday lives and everyday occurrences, where we take these false propagandas of freedom and democracy for granted. They become parts of our everyday living and everyday breathing. Each of these performances critically analyze performances of communicative inversions at crucial junctures of the birth of neoliberalism and reproduction of neoliberalism on the global stage. We argue that the power of neoliberalism lies in the catalysis of concepts such as freedom and liberty, attached to the miracles of the market, as if the market holds the solution to all forms of limitations and primitiveness, to achieve the consolidation of power in the hands of transnational capital. These communicative inversions thus are symbolically violent in their disruption of truth claims and in the very act of achieving these distortions through inversion. So in other words, we make the argument that violence is the way of neoliberalism, but violence is also the way of the market, the way in which it is fashioned into these communicative tools. More powerfully, the communicative inversions are materially violent, often tied to acts of both small-scale and large-scale violence. So you cannot talk about police atrocities and police brutalities, for instance, without looking at the broader picture of the market of neoliberalism and the ways in which the market has been propped up through the very use of violence. The exhibits represented in this collection are drawn from ethnographic fieldwork accounts conducted at CARE, accompanied by earlier photographic work that has been carried out by Julio. So let's go to the first image. What we will do is I will present the context, then I will read the poetry, and then open up the space for Julio to talk about the images. So let's move to Chile, the birthplace of neoliberalism, 1970s. US CIA intervention in Chile in collaboration with local elites and elite actors that sets up the space for free market. The free market model first experimented within the context of Chile. Of course, if you look at the history of Chile within this context opening up to the neoliberal model, this is a history that is tied to not only US intervention through the support of local elite actors and local NGOs to disrupt the existing democratically elected government, but also through the use of force and military, which then opens up a regime of torture and violence. So I will first read my poem. The dreams of freedom seeded in Chicago. If you know, the neoliberal model took its birth in the Chicago School of Economics with Milton Friedman. And the Chicago boys that were trained in Chile came to Chicago to study the neoliberal model. Freedom and the market, freedom in the market, freedom by the market. That must be sown through violence, through networks of NGOs and local elites, through fabricated protests and funding for development as democracy, the dreams of freedom. The dreams for freedom seeded in Chicago, freedom for the market that must be cultivated, by bringing down democracy, through democracy promotion, masquerading as development, through bombings and a calculated coup, through murders, tortures and organized disappearances, through incarcerations that reproduce silences that dreams for freedom. So you see communicative inversion at work. It is the narrative of freedom that ultimately has been sold as the justification for reproducing the neoliberal model. The dreams in freedom, planned in Washington, freedom for an open economy, freedom to trade, freedom for transnational capital, freedom for investments, freedom paid by lives lost, by survivors, by families that must struggle with poverty, by families without resources, amid lost jobs, low pays, and everyday struggles. The dreams in freedom.
Wonderful poem to describe something that was very central to my an earlier stage of my life when I was also in prison in Uruguay, and for the sake of the freedom of the dictators who were imposing a new neoliberal model, not just in Chile but in the whole of Latin America and across the world, of course. And when I came to exile into the UK, it was in the late 70s, early 80s. And of course, Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister, and she was one of the icons of the political model along with Ronald Reagan. And they both shared what happened in Chile. And I went back to Chile in the mid-80s, not without trepidation, because it was a dangerous place to be as a native Uruguayan exile. It was okay to go back to Uruguay after 1984 with the return to civilian rule. But going to Chile was pretty much in danger. I went for a few very kind of unscathed. But going back to that, not just the political thing, I covered the plebiscite in 1988, which they lost, and opened the way for civilian rule and eventually democracy in the late 1980s and 1990s. But some of the very kind of picture that we used in the poster, the poor lady, her husband had been beheaded. A political prisoner, and they just found the head in one place and the rest of the body in another part. And it wasn't the only case, and she went to head a movement of heroes and partners of political prisoners, and that challenged the government, same with that with the cartel. And but also, very importantly, we see the two other ends, the C-colon, which are the children, and who were C-colon, because one of the things that very mirrored in the UK by Margaret Thatcher, exploring the trade unions, especially the coal mining unions, very important, was that by the closures of the mines to challenge the power of the trade unions. They were persecuted in prison. They forced other people on the edge of the economy to just make ends meet, but just basically salvaging coal from the sea, that kind of things, including mines. So these are the effects, and that's the freedom of the market, pretty much. Along with other features that accompany the plebiscite and the eventual return to civilian rule after a very, very long age.
Thanks, Julio. We'll move closer home, Indonesia. Before I read this poem, I want to thank our community partners in Indonesia. Vivek, you're here. Thank you for your courage in telling these stories and for bringing out truth in challenging the kinds of communicative inversions that go back all the way to CIA propaganda. So, if you think about the 1960s, the US played an instrumental role in fighting in the Cold War, the plague of communism. And the plague of communism was a target across Southeast Asia, including Singapore, but Philippines, Indonesia. In Indonesia, in 1965, there was a major killing of community members, of people that were identified as Communist Party members, under the propaganda that these were threats to society. Large-scale killings were orchestrated by the military, working hand-in-hand with CIA and various kinds of political actors. So this particular theme we narrated as violence and development. I also want to put a plug in for a performance this evening. This evening is dedicated to our community activists from Indonesia who will recover these stories and recover narratives that fight the stigma that has been attached to the kinds of communicative inversions that go back to US propaganda and the propaganda of the neoliberal market. So this is a story of 1965. It is a story of pain and torture, but it is also a story of pain, of hope, resilience, and the ability to fight. The freedom song, the song of the free world, the song for the free world, that sings the glories of enterprise and free capital. The freedom song that sings stories of battles won for freedom, for liberty, for the free market. Somewhere in the freedom song, in its valiant account of a freedom-loving world, lies erased the stories of families pulled apart, stories of prisoners, and stories of lost lives. Somewhere in the freedom song lies erased the stories of women raped, of mass graves, stories of people murdered, posed as threats to freedom.
Indeed, we wrote this dramatically posting the so-called domino effect that was part of Kissinger's doctrine in the 1960s with the fountain of Vietnam and communism spreading all over Southeast Asia. That was mirrored in Latin America, in Chile, after the Cuban Revolution. There was a whole pressure from the CIA and American counter-insurgency agencies to nip in the bud any attempts at democratic endeavors. So in Indonesia, I'm very privileged to have worked with Dr. Julio Etchart, she's here, and Mohan, of course, for allowing us to do this amazing research. And Pete and all other partners are here. It was a great pleasure to work with you. This image is actually from the first trip to Jakarta before I met you. This evening we're going to show a pilot of the documentary, which to you as well there. And we're going to give us a fuller picture of what happened during that period of research. But basically, I was really touched and impressed by the resilience of both the victims and survivors of the terrible events that happened 80 years ago. Torture, mass murder, years and years and years in prison camps. And still seeing that amazing element of hope and goodwill and the willingness to get over it and fight the great dose of stigma, which is something that psychologists tell us that we just have forever. I was essentially a heavy sufferer of that through my experience in Uruguay. So I really have a lot of empathy for the people we interview, and we share experiences together. And that's some pictures that I did acquire. We're going to see tonight. Ngura, a young, he's a grandson of a victim of the massacres in '65. Why was my grandfather killed? Just being a member of a progressive organization. Why? And it's going on again with an interview with a young in Bali as well. And his father was also killed. And a lot of his family members disappeared. There's still the kind of, because they have, it wasn't an opportunity to develop a truth and reconciliation commission in Indonesia, as it happened in South Africa and Guatemala. Two countries also suffered terrible massacres in the 70s and 80s, respectively. They had a chance to reconcile, at least to put both parts of the parties and members together. But that's not the case in Indonesia, and I think that is the terrible legacy of what happened in '65. And we're trying to discuss that in the documentary and move forward. But the wonderful story is that the participants from the advisory board that we work with don't want to get over it, and think they're very positive.
I want to add another layer to it.
Sure.
That telling these stories in Indonesia, as you probably would hear from accounts of Vivit and colleagues, is still difficult, if not impossible. Okay, so much for freedom of voices in a model that talks about freedom.
And the bravery of the people who still count.
In the next presentation, we will travel to West Bengal, India. This is one of my field sites for almost 2 decades now. What's happened across various rural sites globally is that the narrative of freedom of the market has been offered as the justification for a particular model of development based on the premise of growth. The idea there is the idea of trickle-down economics, which is that if the country grows economically, if the GDP grows, then the poor will get along, poverty will be alleviated because the poor will have greater access to market and therefore greater opportunities economically. Something that I have found across my field sites, however, is stories that disrupt, interrogate, question this particular linear narrative. The growth in the economy, the growth in GDP does not often translate into the growth in the lives of those that are poor, that are disenfranchised, and that don't have access to resources. As India has embarked since the 1990s on structural adjustment programs and various forms of reforms, what you have seen across particularly rural sites, but also in urban centers, is the closing of factories, the closing of mills, as well as the corporatization, large-scale corporatization of agriculture that has disenfranchised the poor from their fundamental sources of livelihood. Of course, this is something you also saw highlighted in the work of Deccan Development Society in their presentation in the morning. So this poem is called Violence and Development, connecting development to the idea of violence and making the argument that the very notion of development tied to notions of economic growth and progress perhaps is itself a form of violence. The factory for steel, the factory of development, the factory for development, erected on acquired land on the promise of freedom. So across India, for instance, you see various land acquisition strategies that are put together by the state as well as by owners of transnational capital that use a variety of strategies, all the way from PR strategies or what they call community relations, where they bribe community members or mislead them or misinform them in order to take away their land, to the use of police and military to evict them from their land. The Special Economic Zone, SEZs, the promise of development acquired through community relations, through offerings of money and seductions of jobs. So another trope in this development narrative is the offering of jobs. So your family would get these many jobs, so you give up your land. Of course, when we go back in later parts of our fieldwork, that promise of offering of jobs does not translate into real jobs or improvement in economic conditions. The factory of growth. Agriculture is dead, they say, the freedom keepers. Rural is dead, they pronounce. So we must all migrate to cities. Freedom from poverty. The factory of growth, the factory for development, erected through violence on bodies of farmers who won't give up their lands.
Take this back to a very central issue, not just in India, but all over the world, about land in the land, where farmers have been up of the land very, very cheaply and become venture capitalists and modeling basically in factories It was a great, it's a privilege to have this field trip, something like a couple of months ago, which, around the world. And I was actually shocked. I wasn't expecting that level of quality in the Indian and the Western Gulf being such a communist issue. But we did it 15 years ago, but not that far into the depth. And it's to be the basis of land and access to water. That was a very important part. So we focus on water and some of the projects that are bringing water back to the villages and also rebuilding houses with local partners. And wonderful very passionate advisory boards where, a lot of the different views were shared. And I was lost in translation to me, but there's something that sort of a visual worker doesn't get lost into. So you see, we can photograph passion and commitment. And I was incredibly committed. There are a group of people all over the villages that we visited. And the violence is still there, and it's going to remain there for as long as we get the big corporations. We're going to see also one of the projects on the society Praxis to the Monsanto and the GM corporations of the world taking over the organic farming. And I think it's a similar issue with this in the approaching those.
Can you go back to the previous slide? I just want to add another thing. You see, one part of the communicative inversion is in making the argument that the ways of living of the poor, of the rural, are primitive, that need to be therefore replaced by the modern solutions that we bring to them. And that serves an entire industry of academics, people like you and me, the bourgeois classes that draw our salaries and our monies from these projects, funded by them, particularly in communication, right? How many of us are, let's be honest and talk about how many of us have been funded to run marketing programs and materials and slick brochures, bringing the promise of development to communities. But the sad part is that often that trope is a seduction to take away a way of life, to take away a way of livelihood, and to take away people's resources. So the work that the Deccan Development Society, the women farmers, we are so lucky to have you with us, amid us, teach us is that communities, for instance, in India, have amazing resources of knowledge when it comes to agriculture. They don't need Monsanto. Monsanto is a vulture that feeds on ways of life, profits from them, and sells them in a way that is harmful to the environment and harmful to ways of life. But to address that means one has to address the communicative inversions that are fundamental to what we take for granted as ideas of development, ideas of progress. So social change in that sense, hopefully, is an invitation for us to interrogate that which we take for granted, ideas of economic growth, the simple logic that growth leads to development, that has been debunked by evidence again and again, or the simple logic that selling seeds produced by transnational capital leads to development. These stories ask us to question those narratives. The next presentation that we will move to is a global narrative, a narrative that takes us to China, but also takes us globally. It's called iPads, iPods, and freedom. Yeah. Freedom at your fingertips, at my fingertips. Freedom in your hands, freedom for democracy, freedom for markets, all at the tip of your fingers. So we are told, right? You see the series of communication articles appearing in Journal of Communication, Human Communication Research, International Journal of Communication that tell us that you give people internet, you give people Facebook, they will get freedom. All you need to do is to go to Egypt. Cairo, Tunis, Hong Kong, freedom at the fingertips, the slick devices of freedom, the fingers working for democracy. So the National Endowment of Democracy for Democracy in the US, for instance, has a number of projects across the world funded as democracy promotion, ultimately building internet technologies that would supposedly give freedom. Lost fingers that make the devices. For your freedom, for our freedoms, at the fingertips, lost fingers in distant factories. Tired fingers, tired bodies, working long hours, harboring dreams for their freedom. Lost voices in the factory floors, in the trapped bodies, working the long hours for freedom at our fingertips.
Thank you, Mohan. This is one of the where we work in conjunction with a faculty. It was a part of the fieldwork that did, but I've been partially involved with this kind of narrative. I started this when I did the book on toys, because my toys book is not a book for children, but it's a book about play. And also, I visited some of the factories in China. Those which are quite old. You see some of the slides on the right-hand side. That was more contemporary. The digital and also analog and scanned. Basically, when the whole thing started in the 90s, and I went to some of the special enterprise zones, and the coastal cities also in China and Shanghai as well. And so that kind of mindless, 12-hour shift, 3 to 1 project factories. People basically they just live there and work there, and they just don't go out and see the world. And that was the beginning of the Chinese so-called middle. And so that's the freedom that we've been enjoying through our iPads. I bought one myself, so but it shouldn't be like that, really. And the more recent ones, I took when I was doing a project for the Guardian Observer in London about migration and internal migration in China. And things are staggering. As Lily surely knows, one of our colleagues, 10% of the population are internal migrants in China. 130 million is up to 1.3 billion population, which are just basically little villages. And that's one of the projects that our colleague will be working on about behind families as well. So it's part of very much part of the research about leaving the families behind to go over to the cities, to join these big international companies that basically they don't supposed to be there, because you do a Google for Apple and China, and they don't live, because they just subcontract to other subcontractors or their own. But
Next one. Before I read this piece, I would like to thank many of our researchers, Satvir, that have been working on this project, Julio, Naomi, there are a number of care researchers, Pauline, we have Maite back with us and worked with us on this project, when we first started it. This is a project with foreign domestic workers in Singapore. This resulted in a large-scale national campaign on the rights of foreign domestic workers in Singapore. So here the question of freedom is women that come to work from Philippines, Indonesia to Singapore in search of freedom. So it's titled In Search of Freedom. The shining promises of freedom, the promises of a new life, the promises of money, the promises of income to feed the children. Marissa is dreaming of the promises of freedom, having sold her jewelry to pay the agent fees in search of freedom. Marissa is dreaming, trapped in a high-rise, her trapped body dreaming of freedom, of the promises of the market. Marisa is dreaming the day she will get a salary, unpaid for the past 7 months. Promises of freedom. Marisa is dreaming when she will have food. In our work, we were startled by accounts of domestic workers who have gone hungry for days at a go, or who have survived on one piece of toast for the whole day, for days at a go. So Marisa is dreaming when she will have food, when she will talk to her child back home. For many foreign domestic workers, their phones are confiscated from them the moment they enter the employer's house, and they do not have any means of communicating with their families. These are stories that have emerged across our fieldwork. These are promises of freedom. Promises of freedom, promises caged, promises broken, promises trapped, promises lost. So, our fieldwork is filled with stories of dejection, disappointment, and unfulfilled dreams. So, women that say we came with this understanding, and we never knew that this was how it was going to be. But we also don't know how to get out of this.
Absolutely, and this is one currently some of my images, but the main body of work that we produced was participating in practice, photo voice, that I think we, for all of you who have to co-facilitate it and the research. And Rama, who developed the website and the documentary. Thank you so much, all of you. And it goes to the Respect FW Rights campaign. And it was incredible going through the interviews, heart-wrenching, rolling up in tears to find out how much perception, I think that's the tagline here, these days is presented to. And also because we linked the campaign with a sort of traffic in hashtag and perception as an indication of trafficking. And those are two main things that I was trying to find out. But very basic fact, people think about trafficking in the sense of, okay, you smuggle somebody in the back of a boat today, you take it over to Indonesia or Myanmar or Indra or come from North Africa to Italy and all that. No, it's much more subtle than that and much more persons than that. The fact that say, we bring it in and pay you so much, at the end of the day, then that debt, you don't get paid, and you suffer all the things that Marisa suffered. And I think that I'd like to believe that the campaign spearheaded I think it has happened. So thank you all of you who
So economic and financial trafficking, as Julio points out, is one of the key ways of trafficking that the dominant narratives of trafficking don't address. So when we think trafficking, we think sex trafficking. But much more widespread, much more rampant is economic trafficking, trafficking under deception. So you're told when you come to Singapore, you will make $1,200 a month. When you come to Singapore, you end up making $300 a month. So, and of course, this is not just a Singapore issue. This is also a cross-border issue in terms of the sender countries, regulation of agents, the kinds of offers they are making, and which then demonstrates to you the seductions of the market at a global interview, right? The ways in which these work across boundaries to, in many ways at the end of the day, generate cheap labor, but also to generate precariousness, the kinds of jobs that are precarious, that don't have guarantees, that are vulnerable to these kinds of working conditions. So do you want to add anything to this?
Maybe if anybody has any questions about how FDW is traffic, or I can give a summary of the trafficking process. So basically, what happens is that the power lies in the hands of many stakeholders in the process of when FDW gets trafficked. For example, the agent back home will promise the domestic worker a particular salary in USD, say for example indicator or one form of trafficking that takes place. But trafficking in that sense has many indicators for it to be a trafficking case, and that becomes quite problematic because there's so many layers involved. And then when she goes to an employer's home, for example, the employer tells her the contract may lay out that she needs to rest between, she needs to get 8 hours of rest, or she needs to have her meals paid by the employer for all meals while she's at home, or she needs to have her day off on Sundays, for example. But that never happens because the employer has full control. She lives in the employer's home. She's surveillance 24 hours. The passport is taken away from her. Her items are confiscated from her. Her phone is taken away. So in that process, that becomes a case of confinement, another indicator of trafficking. So there's deception that takes place at the start, and then when she's confined and she doesn't have access to external resources where she can contact other people or get in touch with people that she needs help from, then she's completely confined in that situation, and that becomes quite problematic. And when the employer decides, okay, I'm done with you, this is not working out, the employer has complete power to send her back home without transferring her to another employer, and the employer has the power to blacklist her. So when she's blacklisted, for example, she's not able to come back to Singapore, and she loses her agency fees that she pays right at the start to come to Singapore. So there are many, many layers, and in all of our narratives that we hear from domestic workers, these issues keep coming up. So either the agent cheats her, the employer cheats her, or both. And that becomes quite problematic for the domestic worker. Thank you.
So these examples of precarity of work, precariousness of job, are intertwined with the neoliberal project, with the precariousness of the working conditions of the poor. That's one part. But the other part is, if you look at these narratives, these are also narratives of being displaced from land, from agricultural ways of livelihood back in Philippines or Indonesia. So the other thing that we look at when we try to understand these inversions is the ways in which these forms of exploitations are interconnected. A woman displaced from a source of livelihood in the Philippines becomes the woman who is a domestic worker trapped in this kind of condition in Singapore. So that demonstrates to you the vulnerabilities of the poor that are produced across these spaces. Our next project is titled Free Seeds Farming Stories. This goes back to the collaboration with EDS. I will invite either Satish or JT to offer an account after I read the poem, and maybe Julio talks about it. So seeds as technologies of freedom are a key component of the development narrative. The seed is invested with the power to bring about development. So you hear the story of revolution, the green revolution, for instance, Green Revolution 1.1, Green Revolution 2.0, 3.0, the various versions of Green Revolution that are supposed to be brought about through the seed and the corporatization of seed technology. So this poem is inspired by the work of women farmers, the work of EDS, by the work of Satish. Freedom songs, the free seed powered with technology, the source of life, the source of energy, the source of growth. The free seed powered with technology, the seed of growth, the seed of development, the seed of revolution. The free seed, the stolen seed. You realize that the free seed is also the stolen seed. Local varieties of seed that have been co-opted to turn into transgenic varieties that can then not be grown by local farmers, taken out of their hands. The stolen source of life, packaged in marketing and development as the way of freedom. The free seed and untold stories of unpaid debts. Here accounts of the epidemic of farmer suicides across India, connected to the amounts of debts that farmers take out in order to fund these technologies of seed production under the promises of growth and development. Taken out to buy the technologies to bring about the Green Revolution. The free seed and unsung songs of women who farm their fields and protect life. We are lucky to be able to hear many of these songs thanks to your work.
not to JT, but just terrible irony is that a lot of the society in bringing pesticides is also produced by Chinese transnationals. It was a very short trip actually. It was a privilege to be with JT and Mohan on that trip, and we documented, and I think one of our sisters, are you portrayed here, sister? Hello? Is that you? No? One of your colleagues, and it was wonderful to see. It was a day event, seeing all the wonderful procession, that was great, and displaying the scenes that are challenging as a transnational.
Yeah, I think it's better.
Understood it.
Can I sit here and speak?
Yes, absolutely.
I sit and
You see, and of course in his powerful poetic manner, Mohan looked at the distress of seeds. Whereas with the communities that I work with and people who are representing themselves here, I see seed as also, did you mention it as a song of revolution? Right? The new revolution, a song of hope that I see. Everything that Mohan said is true, that farmers are trapped by the seed. Seeds which are supposed to connote life have now become a metaphor for death in India. And every year, thousands of farmers kill themselves because they are trapped in a kind of an agricultural process, basic to which is the fact that seeds are brought from outside and farmers have lost the knowledge of those seeds and they cannot do much about it. In contrast, you see people like Shwama, who is filming there, who preserves something like 85 varieties of seeds in a home. And not only that she is independent of any outside seeds, but she also makes a community independent of outside seeds by lending seeds and see that the community seed bank grows regularly. And it's also interesting that in one of the interactions, she referred to her filmmaking as something like seed keeping. She says that the way I put my seeds in a basket and see that they are protected, they are kept for a generation, I also keep the knowledge of my people within my camera and see that they are there for my own community and the communities in the future to enjoy the fruits of. So the top picture that you see is a caravan of seeds, an annual mobile biodiversity festival that we celebrate every year. And while the rest of India, farmers sing of despair, here the women sing of hope. And for both, seed has become the fulcrum of their feelings. For one, seed represents death, for others, seed represents hope. I would conclude.
Thank you so much, Satish. May I add, Mohan, that it's a wonderful kind of parallel here with a work of an independent photojournalist and dictionary, because we have defended our copyright, against the big transnationals, like the Orbis and Gettys of this world, and we're trying to, and also with the system, trying to keep the record of what you're doing. So we are fighting they want some to solve this world as well in our part. So I often feel that.
Thank you, Satish. Jim, do you want to add?
So I think this is kind of.
The beautiful part is the question of ownership, and I love how you draw the parallel between ownership of the sea, but also ownership of media, ownership of forms of representation, and symbols and sites of representation. And that's what you're talking. We as academics, for instance, don't own the knowledge we produce. That's owned by the Elseviers and the Hurlbaums and the Rutledges of the world, right? And we feel pretty comfortable being sold out as slaves in this kind of way. So it's interesting in terms of what it means for the production of knowledge. The next poem is titled Violence and Invasion. This is, I think, a much more clearer example of this notion of communicative inversion. I go back to 2001 to 2003, after the World Trade Center attacks, and the broader media narrative within the media structures of Iraq, the axis of evil, and how the axis of evil needed to be invaded in order to bring about freedom and democracy. Within this then, as communication scholars, the thing of interest to us is the wholesale manipulation of mainstream media. There are no objective mainstream media, but I would argue that across global spaces, media are the tools of propaganda for global capital and for imperial nation states. So within the context of US, for instance, when the weapons of mass destruction narrative was used within the context of Iraq, there were no interrogations of the narrative in the mainstream media. So when we talk about democracy promotion and media promotion initiatives across the world in the name of democracy, I wonder what is the kind of media we want to promote, to the extent that these are media that serve the interests of global hegemony and transnational hegemony. Violence and invasion. The resounding cry of freedom, freedom from a dictator, freedom from weapons of mass destruction, from chemical and biological hazards, freedom from terror, and terrorists from violence. Now these are not old narratives, these are also contemporary narratives. So what I'm saying in 2003 is very relevant today, and that's why we need to be extra cautious. When we think about Charlie Hebdo, when we think about the Paris attacks, and we see monolithic narratives of the terrorists of Syria that now needs to be attacked, it's the same kind of narrative that needs to be interrogated. Freedom, freedom, freedom chants Christian Amanpour, Bill O'Reilly, Wolf Blitzer. People differentiate between CNN and Fox. There isn't really any difference between these media structures. They are the songbirds of the power structures. The familiar names on network TV, freedom, they argue in a dangerous world. They are after all coming after the freedom of the free world. Freedom from savages who hate the ways of the free world. Amid the freedom cries, amid the bombings and military invasions, over 1 million dead. Count your World Trade Center deaths, and then count the number of deaths in Iraq and Afghanistan, and in Pakistan by your drones. Homes erased, dignity lost, families torn apart, children without families. The resounding call for freedom of the market. So after Iraq is invaded, Iraq becomes another site for the neoliberal experiment under Paul Brenner. So if you really look at that history of economic transition, Iraq, the US says that we will put together a democracy in Iraq, but the first thing they do is put together economic policies in Iraq. Freedom of opportunities for economic growth, for new governance, freedom for war contractors, and oil exploration. So Iraq becomes a free-for-all for US corporations in the wake of the US invasion of Iraq. The resounding call for freedom, crafting a new economy of the market, for the market, freedom without barriers for transnational trade and profits. So you see how the narrative of invasion is also the narrative of freedom. How ultimately the agendas of invasion are tied to opening up the Iraqi market, the markets in the Middle East, to transnational capital.
Indeed, and then another one of our remote patrol collaborations, but I didn't go, I haven't been to Iraq, but I mean, I covered the anti-invasion of Iraq movement, and was very, very integral part of it as a journalist and as a footman during all the marches. And I remember that when people talk about a million people march, they think about Martin Luther King in the 1960s. But in 2003, there were 1 million people in Hyde Park in London begging the government not to go to war, and were totally ignored by Blair and by Bush on the other side of the Atlantic. And I would discover over a number of years, and of course it got much worse. And as Mohan said, now we see the same thing in the UK now, with the Parliament passed bully the opposition into passing a bill on Syria, and what consequences it's going to bring to all of us. So we live in terrible times, and I think that the freedom that talking here is the freedom again of the market. Halliburton was so blatant in 2003 when the vice president himself, was very much involved in the rebuilding of Iraq after the invasion, and it's going to happen again, and we have to be all very cautious and vigilant about that.
One of the interesting questions also worth asking within this context is what then should be the role of academia? I'm looking forward to Collins's talk on leadership. What should academic leadership look like when academic campuses are sold off to the Lockheed Martins and Halliburtons, and you have the Lockheed Martin chair of jet propulsion engineering? What does that then mean about the role of universities within this military industrial complex? I think that's a serious question that we need to ask to imagine radical possibilities. The last poem is Bring It Back Home. Violence and in the Smart City. The smart city narrative is a new narrative. Now India wants to follow the smart city model in the state of Andhra Pradesh in India, right? Now you're going to have a smart city pretty soon, right? Following the Singapore model. So what is the smart city? I would make the argument that violence is built into the notion of the smart city. Smart cities, smart technologies, cities of freedom, cities smart, cities new, technologies that free, technologies of unlimited promise. Smart cities, smart hubs, smart solutions, smart enterprises. Promises of human capital, innovations of progress. Stories are lost here. Stories of work, the hands soaked in soap, the tired legs pushing carts, of thrown away cans. The thing that is striking in our fieldwork, we have a project with Voices of the Poor in Singapore, is a number of elderly that do these jobs. If you go to the hawker centers, pay attention to the people that are cleaning up your plates and putting those away. If you look around the corner, pay attention to the guy that is pushing the cart of recycled bottles and debris. Stories are lost here of hungry days and hungry nights, of unpaid bills, of lost dignity, of broken family ties. Stories are lost here, stories disrupted, stories interrupted, stories untold, stories lost in freedom.
Indeed, this was a major contribution to the care research over the year. I've been covering the inequality in Singapore. It was music to my ears when Mohan said, feel free as a bird to go and cover the two sides of the coin, upstairs, downstairs. I have done legal skill. And there's some, I was really kind of shocked. I mean, the first time I've been to Singapore, hasn't really fallen apart. And the Red Daughter was, has an allure of, it was trying to win the world sense and moral society and all that. Yes, it's a great achievements in the society, and one of the things that have been portrayed on a positive light is the social housing developments, multiculturalism. I think there have been great attempts at getting that right, and I think it works on many levels. It doesn't work in other levels. I did some research here on the so-called Little India riots, and we challenged that, which is very interesting. Another air project, of course. But here I've been trying to navigate all this very, very complex session, and we have the $128 bottle with uncles, the pioneer generation that built this country, that made it happen, still having to work beyond the age of 65 or 70, but else in the world that will have a decent or not, at least a basic pension of that. Still happening, and we have to listen. And thank you so much for allowing me to work.
Yes. And Naomi, I would like to invite you to say a few things because you have been the lead researcher on it.
Yes, so I think this series of photos is very important because many foreigners come to Singapore, and even a lot of Singaporeans don't really know that there's this side of Singapore that's really hidden away by the government. So homeless is actually illegal in Singapore. So the police are instructed to take homeless people off the streets and put them into halfway homes where I've been told they feel like prisoners because they have a curfew to follow, they're given jobs, they're not allowed to go out as amenities. Begging is also illegal in Singapore, they're taken off the streets. And although the social housing policy, as Julio mentioned, is pretty good, and they do have assistance programs for the needy in Singapore, there's still a lot of work to be done. And I think this series of photos has done a pretty good job bringing attention to this problem in Singapore.
Thank you. I think that sort of wraps it up. We want to sort of connect all of these threads together. As you can see, we have been traveling across global sites, but I think you witness a kind of thread that flows across them. And it's a thread of disruption between the stories of the lived experiences of those at the margins and the stories that are circulated in the mainstream. So the question for us, I guess, and I will leave us with that, as communicators for social change is, how do you create spaces, how do you make spaces for these stories so that, Barbara's work on narratives is so imaginative in that sense. How do you make space for these stories so that they can transform these kinds of inequities in the ways in which the inversions are carried out. So thank you for attending, and we look forward to hearing your questions.
I was wondering, so what's next on all these projects?
What's next?
Last 8 years, Professor Mohan Dutta.
That's a real big picture question. I think what's next is that you carry on with the kind of work that draws attention to the inversions and tries to make space for other kinds of stories by turning the cameras of the recording devices, the power of storytelling in the hands of those that have been left out. So, just as with the domestic worker project, it's about returning the hands of storytelling to the hands of domestic workers. Similarly, this is the great space that you're asking this question with the poverty project. We are now getting ready to launch a national campaign on poverty and listening to the voices of the poor in Singapore, a campaign that is designed by the poor in their hands, telling their story. So I think what is next is an ongoing process of telling these stories, and that's the only way you can disrupt narratives that try to erase or that try to tell other kinds of stories.
And I could add that the CCA being built by photo voicing participatory image making is really telling people about who seem to be the process, but also the MPH, which unfortunately we couldn't, feature here. We have some really amazing protocols, narratives that, told by the participants.
I think a big part of this is policy advocacy. At the end of the day, these are advocacy tools. And if you think about the question of effectiveness, just as with the DDS project, a project is effective to the extent it is actually not just able to make space, but be able to address the kind of policies. So when you introduce millet in the public distribution system in India, right, that's an example of a policy intervention. So I think that sort of is the wrong